Hello, you're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Also Young. Tensions continue to rise on the Korean Peninsula, with North Korea continuing to launch ballistic missiles that threaten the South, the United States and Japan. Having rejected Seoul and Washington's offer to hold dialogue and instead only issuing hostile rhetoric, it seems the idea of discussing peace and reunification of the two Koreas is well beyond reach at this point. But according to Dr. Michael Schluter in his book No Other Way to Peace in Korea, the only practical way to break the deadlock is to change the whole equation of the relationship to focus on the shared outcome. And we speak with the author of this book today, Dr. Schluter, who began his career as an economist with the International Food Policy Research Institute and also worked with the World Bank. And since the 1970s, Dr. Schluter has worked to establish peace-building initiatives and institutions that focus on transforming relationships with Christian values that bring hope and vision, especially to conflict-ridden societies. And he was, of course, recognised for his efforts by the late Queen, who appointed him Commander of the British Empire in 2009. It's a pleasure to have you in our studio today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Schluter.
Pleasure.
Right, and well, I've not been able to read through your whole book yet, but I've been able to see some of the key points. I would have loved to have had it. That's a hint for a copy, by the way. But,
we'll take the hint, yes.
Right, well, my first question to you now, your idea is very it's interesting and in a way perhaps maybe a bit provocative as well, because at this time where we're seeing increased tensions, where North Korea has walked out of agreements, they've literally blown up attempts at economic cooperation, and they're issuing all this hostile rhetoric, and on their part they're greatly distrustful of the South as well, and they see South Korea as a puppet regime of the United States. So at this point, could there be a way to peace and reunification? I mean, why do you suggest that talking about unification is relevant at this point?
Well, from our research and thinking and contacts, our view is that no one has really put an acceptable proposal on the table to North Korea. So the North Korean ambassador to the UN in New York said in 2020 they're looking for two things: economic modernization and to be shown respect. Now, the question is, how do they want respect to be shown? And I think they want respect to be shown for their regime, for their abilities and everything else. Now, if South Korea goes on offering aid, which is what tends to happen. So Trump offered a big aid package, we'll give you all these economic benefits if only you denuclearize, or the audacious initiative of our current president in South Korea, I should say your current president, we thought was in some ways very encouraging. It was a bigger offer, a much bolder offer than we'd seen before. But the trouble was, from a North Korean point of view, it seemed rather patronizing. It wasn't really an exchange, it was simply, although the word cooperation was used, it was really a one-way street. Now, North Korea does not want to be seen as, in Confucian terms, the younger brother. It doesn't want to feel that South Korea is now the older brother and it's the younger brother, because it always thought in the past it was the older brother and you were the younger brother, but they wanted to be treated as equals. So it needs to be a trade agreement, not an aid offer that they're looking for, and it needs to be a big one to make it worth their while starting to negotiate.
Right, and well, we can't give away, the entire, concept of your book, but could you introduce this concept that you talk about, the mutual convergent development framework that should be established between the two Koreas?
Yes, so our position is that you can't have instant reunification. I mean, and we don't think North Korea will implode. So we think that North Korea is not suddenly going to become like South Korea, and then everything will be, hunky-dory and beautiful. The way we see it is there's got to be a process of mutual, that is two-sided, coming together of the two systems. So one is a communist system, socialist system, one is a capitalist system. How do you bring about some, quotes, convergence? Now, we're not talking about, in our book, we're not talking about a compromise. We're talking about North Korea and South Korea both moving to a third alternative system, which is different from either socialism or capitalism. And that means South Korea has to be willing to change as well as North Korea. So it's quite a challenge to both states if they're going to make those changes. Quite a big challenge.
And you stress the fact that the two Koreas until now, they haven't been able to really see eye to eye on what is in their mutual interest. But in terms of acting in self-interest, though, or what's rational, we tend to assume that it's rational actors working towards a common interest. But when we see the North Korean regime, though, they seem anything but rational. They seem rather erratic. So do you think that Kim Jong-un is a rational actor?
No, I think he's totally rational, totally rational within his understanding of the situation, which I have to say as an outsider, a third party, to me, I live in Cambridge in England, and we're a Swiss organization, but so living in my context and thinking with my international peace-building experience, it seems to me a very rational position. So what he's thinking is, we've seen our countries destroyed by American bombers in the past. I mean, go back to 1953, 1952, 53, American bombers destroyed every single building in Pyongyang, I think except one. So that's still a living memory for them. And secondly, he thinks if he denuclearizes unilaterally, this is unilateral disarmament. So US is not proposing to denuclearize at the same time. So they will be denuclearized and US will not be denuclearized. So what has happened to other countries that denuclearized with promises of American protection and benefit? Well, think Libya, and they replay the story of what happened in Libya every single week on television in North Korea to remind themselves of what happened. And of course, it was disaster. They got completely demolished by US and UK military aircraft. I mean, demolished. And look at Ukraine. UK, US, promised that they would guarantee the security of Ukraine against Russia or anybody else if they denuclearized. And they did denuclearize. And then what happened in 2014 with Crimea? You know, Russia just took over Crimea, and did the US, UK do anything? No. So they look at all that record, that track record, and they say, well, if we denuclearize, what's going to happen? So I think if you want total denuclearization in North Korea, the only way to get it is to have reunification. You can get steps towards it, though. I think you can get a missile freeze. I think you can get no more nuclear tests, those sorts of things that were in the Comprehensive Military Agreement of 2018. I think you can get those things in return for some sanctions exemptions to be able to start the modernization process in North Korea. Those things I think you can get. But I think you have to see Kim Jong-un as a totally rational actor.
I see. And well, when we talk about unification, though, we normally assume that South Korea would want a unified Korea under liberal democracy, while the North would want it under its own terms, possibly with the influence of China. But when thinking about this whole idea, we see China continuing to talk about, a forceful unification of Taiwan if needed, and they say they're going to be ready to invade by 2027,
yes.
those kind of things.
Yes.
I mean, how do you think North Korea is looking at this? Does this make the conversation about unification of the two Koreas even more urgent at this point?
Well, I think it does make it more urgent, but I'm much more optimistic about what could happen between China and Taiwan, actually. And I think what's in our book on Korea has important lessons for possibilities between China and Taiwan, because I have friends from that part of the world, and they point out to me that in Fujian province, people speak the same dialect of Mandarin as they do in Taiwan. They have enormous trade. In fact, I heard that there are 780 flights a week going across, or were going across before COVID. So there's a lot of trade going on. The academics all know each other. They've done joint research projects. I mean, there's a community down there. So I think that if you start to unpack what's involved and you look at the health system, Taiwan's health system is probably better than mainland China's. If you look at the education system and how you might bring the two into some alignment and bring about some shared goals, I think you can see all sorts of ways you could bring them closer together. Now, obviously, the end game is the really big problem. What happens about political autonomy in Taiwan, those sorts of things. But I think the closer you get them to understand each other and work and cooperate with each other, I think a solution would emerge. That's my view. And I think you're in a very different context than Hong Kong. So I've been to Hong Kong a lot. I was there in 2014, talking to them there about the situation with China. I think you're in a very different context here.
I see, and in such a, well, right now we're in an environment of high distrust, and well, you introduce, the need to have, a layer of that basis of forgiveness between these conflicting parties, and I'd like to hear more about that, why that's so important.
The need for forgiveness, yes. Well, my wife's a counsellor, and she is trying to help people overcome all kinds of personal problems they have with neighbors and friends and other people. But if you're not willing to forgive the other party in any relationship, it really acts like a blockage on any progress in building trust. So you have to seek forgiveness. And the interesting conversations I've been having here with the churches are they willing to talk to their congregations about forgiving North Korea, forgiving the people in North Korea who they feel have separated their families or who they feel are threatening them. And I think in North Korea too, there is going to be a need for forgiveness. They think back to what happened in the south of South Korea. In the past, they think that communists were killed brutally and all those sorts of things. So there's a lot of bitterness around on both sides, but at some point, there's got to be a spirit of forgiveness. And speaking as a Christian myself, I believe that people can be forgiven can forgive if they recognize how much they have been forgiven by God for things that they've done wrong. So that's, for me personally as a Christian, I understand that. I realize many people are not Christians, so they don't share that point of view. But I think they have to recognize that if you don't forgive, you've got a permanent blockage in that relationship.
Right, there has to be a way to overcome differences in political ideology that's been separating this nation for decades.
Yes, absolutely.
Really.
And that's why we suggest a third path that lies between communism and capitalism. We call it, relationism or something like that. But it's if you start making front and center not economic growth, but getting your relationships right between your stakeholders, between your ethnic groups, between nations, if relationships are your primary interest, then economics tends to look after itself. And the evidence around the world, whether it's in schools or in the medical profession and elsewhere, is if you get the relationships right, you get better outcomes. So there's plenty of evidence to back up this idea.
I see. And lastly, so the status of ceasefire between the two Koreas, it was brokered by the United States and China as well. And they're quite important players in the whole Korean peace process. And it seems that they're not as interested in unification or even permanent peace between the Koreas at the moment. They just care about stability. So how would they be sort of brought on board with the idea of looking for permanent peace and unification, and what would their roles be?
So we don't think there is any denuclearization without reunification. We don't think North Korea will ever fully give up its nuclear weapons without reunification of the peninsula, where you have a unified government for the Korean Peninsula. Now that means that China and the US have a strong mutual interest, because neither of them want nuclear weapons on this peninsula. And now that South Korea wants its own nuclear weapons, and they are favoring making their own, and North Korea's got nuclear weapons, from a Chinese point of view, this is really undesirable. Japan's now talking about having nuclear weapons. They're going to be surrounded by nuclear weapons. And that's something they really do not want. So US doesn't want North Korea to be, be a nuclear power, nor does China. So they have a shared interest. The question is, how do you start the process? So if I could just say one word about that before we finish. So we're suggesting a mutually agreed trade agreement between North and South Korea, which is how peace was brokered effectively between France and Germany after the Second World War, when they are almost about to go to a Third World War over the resources in the Ruhr valleys. So if you follow the European pathway, just in some small way, at least to get started, why not form a Korean Peninsula agriculture community where North Korea exports a lot of agricultural products to South Korea, including a lot of kimchi, which apparently South Koreans really like North Korean kimchi, but you probably know that better than me. So, but not only kimchi, but they have a lot of marine products, they have forestry products, they have all kinds of things that they could export to South Korea. But South Korea could export to them improved seeds, fertilizers, agricultural chemicals, farm machinery, equipment for farming, like plastics for their growing their vegetables up there, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many things that South Korea could export to North Korea to revolutionize their farming. But it would be a trade agreement. It's not aid now. This is on mutual terms that they both want, they both benefit from, and then it could expand from there to a Korean Peninsula economic community, like Europe went from the coal and steel community to the European coal and steel community, moved on to the European Economic Community, the EEC. And then the European Economic Community went to the European Community, and then it became the European Union, didn't it? So if you follow that kind of pathway and you go first to a trade agreement in one sector, agriculture we suggest, maybe that's because I'm an agricultural economist, so I know most about that. And then you move on to all products. So all North Korea's minerals could come southwards, and all the power equipment, the transport equipment, everything else from South Korea could go north in exchange for the minerals. If you think of something like that, you could imagine enormous prosperity growing to both countries, or both states, I should say. They're not really countries. I think of Korea as one country, both states. But then you need to move on beyond the trade to other areas. You need to look at how to bring the health sector, the education sector, all the sectors into alignment. So that's what's built out in the book.
Right. So it really begins with building that solid mutual ground for future cooperation. And I'm afraid this is all the time we have.
That's fine.
But please,
thank you very much.
This book is available in bookstores, so you can read it for very practical ways on how to build this framework of cooperation.
And from Amazon as well, I think. Yep.
And from Amazon as well.
Yep.
And thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Schluter.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Also, thank you very much to our viewers for tuning in. Global Insight is on air from Monday to Friday, South Korea time. Wherever you are in the world, have a lovely day. Goodbye.